fellow South Africans, our beloved Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed. He passed on peacefully in the company of his family around 2050 on the 5th of December.
Good evening. Welcome to another exciting program of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight in the Queen's Grapevine, we want to take the opportunity to talk about a great leader that just passed away. The world just lost someone that made a difference in this country and worldwide. I'm talking about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, which was born in South Africa, went through a lot to try to equalize things in his country, and it wasn't an easy thing. When we think about apartheid, which is a very difficult thing to understand from a human standpoint about, and it's also illogical. We know here in America there's been a lot of racial issues that affected this country, but when you look closely at the apartheid situation in South Africa, it's totally inhuman. And Nelson Mandela went to prison many times and various occasions trying to find equality for his people and the whole. It is difficult for me to understand how the black community was larger there, over 20 million people, and the white community was only 4.5 million, and they control everything. Today in the Queen's Grapevine, we're going to have the opportunity to walk and talk a little bit with a great community leader here in the tri-state area. I'm talking about Mr. Jaime Estes, who has been kind enough to be in our program to talk a little bit about the leadership and the legacy of Nelson Mandela, this great icon that we just lost. Jaime, welcome to our program.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's good to have you. We had the opportunity to work with another attorney that's a great friend of yours, Howard Jordan, and he recommended you, and we read a lot about it, some of the fantastic work that you have done in the community, and we feel very privileged and honored to have you on board here in Grapevine.
Oh, thank you so much. Likewise. Yeah.
Tell me, how you think Mandela will be remembered in his legacy?
Well, there is a little bit of a debate right now regarding how he's going to be remembered. I think that the figure of Nelson Mandela has been sanitized in a way in order to make it look more digestible to white Americans and to the United States and to industrialized countries. He's a man who became, there are two Mandelas. One that was the revolutionary, the one that basically was in charge of the military branch of the ANC. And he ended up in jail because organizing those military strategies against the apartheid government. And then there is the second Mandela, is the one that comes after prison and becomes president of South Africa. And I think that people rather to remember the second one and ignore the other one and say that he was basically an individual that always fought for peace, but forget that there is another one who also fought for peace, but with different strategies and tactics, that during those times, it was the only option in order to survive as a people, African people in South Africa.
It's amazing that you mentioned that. Our research showed exactly the same thing, that back in the 50s and 60s, what he went through and what he did, he was forced to do what he had to do. I mean, at one point, he left the country legally, and when he came back in, he was arrested because he went out abroad to try to explain to people in Europe and all over the world what was taking place there. Let's go back a little bit to the 50s and 60s. What was going on in South Africa was really barbaric. There's no other way of calling it. And, you know, he and the ANC stood up to him. What are some of the things that were coming out of South Africa at that time? Were we cognizant what was going on, or is this just after the fact we found it?
No. Like any system of segregation in the United States, was Jim Crow. In South Africa, it was called apartheid. There was not much difference. These type of things usually can be affected by international pressure. Mandela understood that even better than it was understood in the civil rights movement in the 1950s here in the United States. One of the issues during the Cold War that basically helped the civil rights movement in the United States was the fact that the news started going outside the United States. The Soviet Union then used that as a propaganda in order to use it against the United States.
And rightfully so.
And rightfully so. And the same thing happened in South Africa during those years in the 1950s. Mandela utilized the international community in order to put pressure on the apartheid system.
Because he unmasked them using the newspaper and bringing out on television things that was happening, I imagine.
Yes, and the thing is that little by little, gradually, then it became an international movement that basically helped his excarceration. Without that international pressure and the sanctions that were eventually imposed in South Africa, he may have been spent all his life in prison. But that is extremely important to understand, that the world has something to say of what happened in other countries. And even gradually, their influence is gradual, but at the end, it has a result. Here in the United States was an accomplice of the apartheid system.
Wow.
They basically support apartheid. There were very few that basically in the media talk about what was happening in South Africa. And people like you that have cable shows, when the cable shows started emerging, they started talking about it. One of them was Gil Noble.
Good man.
Good man, Gil Noble.
Like It Is.
And Like It Is. He was the only one at one point talking about it, and people tend to forget about it. I remember when Mandela came to New York, there was a big debate in the Nelson Mandela Welcome Committee about whether Mandela should go to Gil Noble's show. And the debate was Gil Noble versus Ted Koppel, Nightline. And people said, yes, we understand what Gil Noble did. When no one was talking about Mandela, when no one was talking about South Africa, he was the only one talking about it. But we need to put him in a more national venue. So there was a big debate about it.
A bigger stage, so to speak.
Bigger stage. And Ted Koppel, those that were supporting the Ted Koppel show, won the debate. And
because he probably had a larger audience.
Larger audience, and it was very important. However, if you remember when Mandela went to the Ted Koppel show, Ted Koppel tried to sanitize his figure, his involvement in the system, and Mandela basically, his answers told him, that's not the person that you think I am.
Interesting that you mentioned that. For those of you who might not know who Gil Noble was, Gil Noble worked for Channel 7 for many years. He had a show on Like It Is on Sundays. It was the only show that actually dealt with the issues that affected minorities, not only in the United States, but worldwide. Gil Noble was way ahead of his time. It took Channel 7 a while to have the intestinal fortitude and the guts to put on a show like that. But once they did, Gil Noble brought out so many different things that was taking place here. And not only that, he went globally with a lot of things. And so, as Jaime just mentioned, Gil Noble was ahead of his time. Let's go back to some of the issues with Mandela. I am surprised that at the time in the 50s and 60s, they didn't kill him, considering the fact that what he was doing, and he was bringing out in light the behavior of South Africa there. The racist behavior, the problems, the way how they treated, because, you know, there was a lot of problem here also in America racially, but how would you compare both South Africa versus America, the way how they treated minorities?
There was not much difference. As I said before, one was called apartheid, one was Jim Crow, but basically they both segregated people by race. And there was no equality. There was one sector of that population that was oppressed, that it was a violent oppression, it was an educational oppression, it was a cultural oppression, but especially it was a violent oppression. Regarding your question in terms of why they didn't kill him, you don't want, every system understands something, is that there are certain individuals who are leaders that once they die in a brutal manner by the system, they become martyrs. There are other people for life. And they're more powerful in death than in life. they identify Mandela as that type of individual because they didn't stop killing people. Like they didn't stop lynching people in the south of the United States. People were dying every year in the hundreds in both places. But there are these individuals that are so charismatic that if they do the same to them, they are creating a ghost that will never disappear and will live forever. That's why Mandela was one of those special individuals, and they didn't do it. They couldn't do it.
So in other words, if that touched him at that time, they would have made him bigger than what he actually is now, and it probably would have brought all type of repercussions to them in more ways than one.
Exactly. And perhaps the apartheid system would have ended even before. I'm not saying that for sure, but I think that that was the fear that they had because it may have been uncontrollable. They couldn't be able to control the people then. Because then when people were willing to die, and when people are willing to die, you cannot stop that movement.
Well, one of the scariest things about the apartheid, as we did a little bit of research on this thing, is that minorities had a certain amount of identification. They could only go into certain place if they were working. That's the only time they could get into certain part of the city. A white person, even if they were not a policeman or part of the government, could stop you and ask you for an ID. And if you didn't present an ID, they could have you arrested. That's how violent and how prehistoric and diabolic their behavior was, that it's scary. I would imagine that it took a lot of guts for Mandela in more ways than one, and those who were being part of the movement to stood up to something like this, knowing the consequence and knowing the repercussions coming to them.
Yes, but the same thing was happening in the United States too.
Wow.
And I think that's why the United States, during all those years, was an accomplice of the apartheid system. Even when Mandela came to New York, I remember working in the Nelson Mandela Welcome Committee. We had the FBI was a part of the committee, even when they didn't have any jurisdiction to be in the committee because that's a federal agency. If anything, it was the New York Police Department
that should be there.
Who should be there. And there was someone in one of the meetings because there were a lot of people very upset about the FBI present because they basically had like the last word.
A mandate.
On everything based on safety and issues. You know, safety and issues are magical words. When the FBI or the police department says this is a safety issue, even if it's not, then everything ends. And they tried to sabotage as much as they could. In one meeting, someone said, if it was up to the FBI, Mandela will come to JFK, wave through the window of the airplane and take off.
Not surprising. Not surprising coming from them. You know, they magnify things when they want to. When we get back in the Queen's Grapevine, we want to take the opportunity to talk about the Welcome Committee that were here when Mandela came to New York, the way how he was idolized, and the Dinkins receivement of Mandela. We'll be right back in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about a real true hero, Nelson Mandela.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine talking about the legacy of Nelson Mandela. Those of you know that we just lost Nelson Mandela recently at 95 years of age. We lost him, and we're talking about the impact of what he did in South Africa, the fight that he, and the movement that he had, and what some of the things that he went through. And more importantly, the legacy that he lives, the memory, and as Jaime just mentioned to you, that there are two scope of looking at it. It was that Mandela that stood up to that government back in the 50s and 60s, which is a big no-no, a person of color sent up against a huge institution like that, and the amount of savagery and barbaric behavior of the government there, killing innocent children and killing people just out of pleasure. He didn't have any say. And to think about in those days, a man as Mandela, even when he was in prison, organizing the movement, and he never gave up. He never took any type of concession, which the government tried on many occasions while he was in prison to see if he would do some type of concession and they'll release him. He had the strength and the drive to say no. And we just want to talk about these things. For those youngsters who are watching our program and follow us for all these years, to know that, you know, there are certain stories that is highly imperative for you to know, even though some of the things have changed here in the United States of America, but there are people them who did the walk and did the movement for you to have some of the privileges that you have. And the same thing Mandela did. If you watch some of the things that just had the memorabilia that they did with him, the students who said, now we're in college because we have the opportunity thanks to the sacrifice that Mandela did, and we don't want that to go unnoticed. And that's why we're doing a program of this type of magnitude. Our program, you don't have commercial interruptions, so I think is more of a situation you get the reality and you get to find out more. I mean, let's talk a little bit. Mandela was released from prison February 19, 1990, and I think 5 or 6 months after he came into New York. Talk to us a little bit, A, the reception that he got, 2, who was it the idea to put together such a tremendous reception, and the pros and cons and the sensitivity of putting something like that together, and how did New York tri-state area receive that hero?
Well, first we have to put it in the historical context. Just 6 months before, David Dinkins was elected the first African American mayor of New York City, just 6 months before. And my understanding is that Bill Lynch, who was the campaign manager,
good man,
for David Dinkins, was the one who basically came up with the idea. Wow. And shared it with Dinkins and said it would be really important to bring Nelson Mandela to New York.
Let's stop for a second and we'll go back. For those of you who don't know, Bill Lynch was very strategic in getting Mandela elected, and so was he in doing the same thing for the new mayor that we have now coming in January, de Blasio.
Yes. And obviously the idea was accepted. At that time, Mandela was still seen as what he was while he was in prison. Someone that he was a militant, someone that was willing to give his life for his country, etc. To have Mandela in the United States, but especially in New York, but even more especially in the United Nations, it created a lot of problems.
Chaos.
For politically, also for the United States, because you still have a movement here, especially in the African American community, that basically had been fighting racism even after Jim Crow. And there are local groups that call themselves revolutionary movements, etc. So the last thing they wanted was to have
something like that.
Something like that here. And that it was going to be such a huge event. And by the way, that's what happened. It became a huge event. So the United States was very, very concerned about his presence here. And it was demonstrated in terms of how they participated in.
And they tried to block it at the beginning.
Yes. Also, apartheid still existed. Apartheid had not ended. And the will in South Africa was still to continue apartheid. It was the beginning of the end of apartheid, but it was happening during those days.
Was still alive.
And the United States, even when they had sanctions, it still was an accomplice of that situation. And it was extremely important politically. When he came here, we had so many events that people were requesting to do with Mandela. High-profile people, high-profile organizations, high-profile institutions, like I said before, the shows, the TV shows, etc. And in order to decide, was very difficult to decide, but also, as I told you before, the issue of the FBI intervention, basically saying no to this, saying no to that, or diminishing the role of Mandela and then trying to present it in a way in which it was more digestible, more peaceful. So in order to prevent the dissemination of that type of militant spirit that it was in him.
They wanted to control.
Well, it's basically trying to present an image that it was more friendly, supposedly, and according to the American white culture. So it can be more digestible,
Wow.
if you want to say.
Let's go back to one thing. You got to give a lot of credit also to Dinkins, because he was just elected mayor and the first African-American mayor, taking a step like that. And New York is a capital society, so I'm quite sure they thought about the expenses associated with that and, you know, and all that reception that they gave him in the canon of heroes down in the Wall Street area. It must have been very difficult for Dinkins to put it together also. What are some of the biggest challenges that you think he went through?
Well, he made a great decision. It was to appoint Jim Bell, who was the president of the Black Trade Unionists, and he also was the political action director at District 65 UAW, where I used to work, and that's where I met Jim, and we created a great relationship. He brought me to work with him. So Jim was in charge of organizing the event. We used to have meetings at 7:30 in the morning, Fridays, and you had 150 people in that room at 7:30 in the morning. You have people like Harry Belafonte, you have people that came from Black Panthers, people that rock and roll players. One of them was from Springsteen band, the guitarist who eventually did The Sopranos.
Right.
He was there. He was the one that I always remember convinced the Empire State Building to change the colors for that week for the ANC colors, the flag of the ANC. And so it was very diverse. And Jim, I always remember him, not only because he was such a nice person to me. And colorful, but at the same time, he was someone who knew how to talk to people with different backgrounds and different agendas. And he was able to basically convince them about, you know, this is the goal, this is the objective, and we need to put all these different differences aside. That's an art to do that. So Jim was the one who basically organized all that with a lot of assistance, as you know, the 150 people in the room, everybody trying to cooperate. But it wasn't an easy task. I never saw Jim taking a weekend off during those 5 to 6 months that took to organize. And I think that, you know, I don't want people to forget about Jim Bell.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the National Puerto Rican Movement. Were they involved in any way into it, as being a part of the Welcome Committee and stuff like that?
Well, basically, we thought in the Puerto Rican community, and since I was working there, that if someone could give the real welcome to Mandela, were people that spend the longest time in jail as political prisoners, not only in the United States, but in this hemisphere. They spent 28, 30 years. I think Oscar spent 30 years in prison, even longer than Mandela.
Wow. And
we said, you know, if someone should give them the welcome, it's the Puerto Rican political prisoners. So I spoke to Jim. Jim spoke, to make the story short, spoke to the ANC. The ANC approved it, said that it was fine. And we were going to have them in a very humble event. We were trying to decide whether it was going to be the United Nations, Harlem, or Yankee Stadium. And, you know, the FBI went nuts on that. And that's the last thing that they wanted to complicate things. And we had everything set up until Jim basically told the press that they were coming. Then my understanding is, I don't have direct knowledge, but Dinkins avoided the press for a whole day from 7:30 in the morning to almost 7:30 at night. And because they kept asking about it. Basically, it was one journalist, that's my understanding. And then around in the afternoon or the evening, it seems that he received a call from Washington. And then he made that unfortunate comment that Mandela shouldn't meet with those assassins.
Wow.
And the Puerto Rican nationalists, they didn't kill anyone. They were as revolutionaries as Mandela was. And that was unfortunate. What happened in that conversation, if it happened, only he knows, but he tried to avoid it. And whatever pressure he got was an enormous one. I think that he regret that. Eventually, after that event, he signed a letter for President Clinton to basically liberate the remaining Puerto Rican political prisoners in the United States.
Wow.
So he tried to make amends. It wasn't easy. So, you know, it was a mistake. It had a lot to do with the ignorance that people have about other countries, which is normal. But it was unfortunate. Before that, just to put it in context, Dinkins, 2 weeks before Mandela came, named a street for John Doherty, an IRA revolutionary who was in prison in the United States because he was accusing Ireland to kill a British soldier.
Oh, wow.
So Dinkins named a street for him in front of the federal court, which is a slap in the face of the federal government. So that was the context of what was happening with Mandela. And then to say that about the Puerto Rican nationalists, we thought that it was completely unfair, and hell broke loose.
I imagine also for the FBI, it must have been some type of, in their mind, some type of difficult knowing that different type of groups were coming, people from the Black movement, the Puerto Rican movement, the Black Panthers, stuff like that. So that must have set up like a haywire in their mind in terms of security and their concern with.
Yes, well, especially the Harlem event. I remember going to meet with them because the nationalists were invited by them to go there. And the frustration that they had, the words that they were saying about the FBI that I cannot repeat here, because you know you had the Patrick Lumumba coalition headed by Lambert Brath, you have former Black Panthers, you have all these different organizations, and that was their event, and that was not an event that they were not happy with.
Yeah. I'm quite sure it was. I remember Lambert Brath, also a very tough leader, Platel Benjamin, all those guys were in the movement, so I remember go back. Well, you know, we have approximately 1 minute. If there was a message that you would like to give our youngsters about Mandela and about that event that happened in New York when he was received with so much love and so much aura, this is your opportunity.
What he got in New York was what he deserved, and he deserved more. I think that my children, I want them to read more about Mandela. It's my job to do that.
Good. In behalf of the family of the Grapevine, we want to take this opportunity to tell you thank you so much for watching our show, and we hope that it has been to your liking. But more importantly, please do not forget men like Mandela that have made a difference today. If it wasn't because of him, that type of idiotic and prehistoric and barbaric action of the apartheid movement in South Africa will still continue. Now, more important, with the loss of him, we just hope that South Africa have learned the legacy that he have left behind and their progress for freedom and equality continue. This is Wallingford Lee saying good night for the Queens of Grapevine, and see you next week at the same time at the same place.
Campaign. Through 46664, he continues to lend the full force of his extraordinary talent, intellect, and heart to a problem that faces not only his own country, but the world at large. Nelson Mandela, Madiba, we salute you.